Good evening. I'd like to welcome you to this Pears Institute event being held here at Friends House. I'm David Feldman. I'm the director of the Pears Institute for the Study of Antisemitism. And it really is a great pleasure to introduce to you this evening Maud Mandel. Maud is professor of history and Judaic studies at Brown University in the United States. I think, apart from the title, what I think is really important to say about Maud is that she, I think, is one of the leaders of a new generation of historians, really, who are transforming our understanding of the French Jewish history, and not least transforming our understanding of that by placing the history of French Jews within the framework of the French Empire and within the framework of other minorities in France. And that, I think, is an important movement in the field going on at present, and Maud really is at the front of that movement. Her first book, her first monograph, was called In the Aftermath of Genocide, Armenians and Jews in the 20th Century, and she has very recently published Muslims and Jews in France, History of a Conflict, published by a Princeton University Press. In my line of work, every so often one is approached by publishers to write an encomium, which goes on the back of books, and one's supposed to say how wonderful it is. And often one does this perhaps more out of a sense of politeness than conviction. However, when I wrote for the back of Maud's book, it genuinely was out of a sense of conviction. It is a fantastic study, and you can take a flyer from the back of the room and use that flyer to purchase your very own copy after you hear Maud's lecture this evening. I'm sure you will want to. Maud's lecture, which, like her book, is called Muslims and Jews in France, The History of a Conflict.
And thank you all for coming out. I gather there's a lot of things happening on campus and around London. Just got a few things going on, so thank you for coming out to hear me speak this evening. In autumn of 2000, as many of you probably remember, Muslim-Jewish relations in France captured national and international attention following a dramatic spike in anti-Jewish violence. This was largely the work of Muslim youth from the country's most disadvantaged sectors, and the violence started to raise alarms about this rise of anti-Semitism in France and potentially emerging ethno-religious conflict in that country. And since then, of course, there have been periodic moments of dramatic bloodshed, such as the 2006 torture and murder of the 23-year-old Ilan Halimi and Mohammed Meraz's March 2012 shooting of a rabbi and 3 children at a Jewish school in Tunis. And so these events have kept fears in the air about what's happening between France's Jewish population, about rising intolerance towards Arabs among Jews, and also among Muslims towards France's Jewish population, all of this raising a certain fear that France's 2 largest ethno-religious minorities have relations that are forever damaged. And explanations for this state of affairs have ranged rather widely. So some have stressed a Muslim Judeophobia rooted in the conflict between Islam and Judaism since time immemorial. Others have pointed to the combustible fusion of radical Islam and anti-Zionism, while still others have focused on social inequities in contemporary France, suggesting that the violence that we have today is really more of an outbreak of frustrations of disenfranchised Muslim youth and an increasingly enclosed ethnically Jewish minority. More commonly, however, commentators have focused on the ever-spreading impact of the Arab-Israeli conflict, posing that affinities between French Muslims and Palestinians and Jews and Israel have led to some kind of inevitable polarization between them. So when I set out to write the book, and I'm really drawing today from this book that I wrote, my goal really was to challenge this assumption of inevitable polarization that seemed to be coming out in a lot of the media coverage at the time of that I was beginning the process of research. Polarization, I really thought, was a pretty gross simplification of Muslim-Jewish relations in France, and I began my research most drawn to the many cultural, historical, linguistic, and cultural links between these two populations, and there are many. France has the largest Jewish and Muslim populations living side by side outside of Israel. There are the United States has bigger populations of both, but they don't come from the same place and they don't live in the same places. Current estimates have something like 4 to 6 million Muslims and something like 500 to 600,000 Jews. As I'm sure you know, France doesn't ask on census questions about religious identity, so it's a little hard for us to get an accurate number, but it's something like that. And many of these, the Muslim population and the Jewish population, although not all, came from North Africa following decolonization. So sharing certain linguistic and cultural traditions, a common experience of displacement. Many of these newcomers felt similar pressures to assimilate. They often felt rejected by the nation trying to integrate them. In other words, they shared much in common, lots of cultural, linguistic, residential, and historical connections. And all of this is to say that Muslim-Jewish relations in France was never defined solely as a bitter war over Palestine and Israel, Islam and Judaism, or any other set of binary divisions that you can think of. But one of the things that struck me as very interesting as I started my research into this project is that conflict dominates the archival record of Muslim-Jewish relations. I'm a historian, so one can study things from lots of different directions, but the way historians study things is we go into archives, we go into published sources, we look at how people record the history of what's happened. And you won't be surprised to find out that the only time stories of Muslims and Jews make it into archives is when they're not getting along. Because police, for example, write reports only when people are fighting, not when they are convivially living in a neighborhood and getting along. And newspapers, for the most part, and magazines tend to write stories about conflict. That's what interests readers. That's what people buy. So that's what I quickly discovered, not, I guess, all that surprisingly when I started to do the research. So even if relations between Muslims and Jews in France have been multiple and variegated, it was actually the episodic inter-ethnic political disagreements that most often caught the attention of the social actors of the day, whether they were French police, Algerian nationalists, Jewish student activists, second-generation Muslim anti-racist activists, organizers, etc. So as I began to follow these sources in my research, my interest evolved from a straightforward challenge of the narratives of Muslim-Jewish conflict into an examination of how such narratives emerged and in time actually helped to produce the very conflicts they purported to recount. So my talk today is going to draw from this research on the evolution and political meaning of conflict to consider the processes through which the categories Jew and Muslim became political symbols, even as actual Muslims and Jews often never clashed with one another. In fact, the very term Jew and Muslim hide as much as they reveal, because they cluster together various national and ethnic groups under broad religious categorizations that imply homogeneity and communal identifications in place of the actually profound heterogeneity that characterizes each of these populations. But what I'm going to suggest today is that heterogeneity was actually largely irrelevant to the hardening of the political binary Muslim-Jewish that I'm going to be exploring. And central to the story I'm going to tell you is going to be a story about France itself. So, of course, global developments, particularly in the Middle East, created all kinds of tensions and fault lines along which Muslims and Jews sometimes clashed, as we will see. That is an ever-present part of this story. On the other hand, as we'll see, the nature of mobilization around these issues, that is, who was involved, the political rhetoric they involved, the words they used, the things they were talking about, and the success or lack of their appeal, really, I am going to be arguing today, came from French political transformations. And I would also add that the impact of the Middle East was never straightforward. So I just want to read you one citation from an Algerian Jew speaking to a researcher, an anthropologist in the early 1990s. He said, "When we say the Arabs, I feel hatred. But those are Middle Eastern Arabs. I'm not talking about the Arabs who live in France, because they don't do us any harm. They work, they earn their living, they have children and families like us, à la française. That's fine." So, as such a remark should suggest, focusing solely on the Middle East in an effort to understand Muslim-Jewish politics in France misses some of the key aspects of the story. So my goal then today is not to remove the Middle East from the equation. Again, it's going to pop up in my comments for sure, but I want to underscore the way global dynamics, both in the Middle East, but also, as we'll see, in French North Africa, came together with national and even local factors to shape Muslim-Jewish relations in post-colonial France. And I'm, in this talk, not going to spend a lot of time on the local. The book I'm drawing from focuses quite a lot on the city of Marseille, but I can't talk about everything. So if you're interested, you can buy that. But in fact, the book makes a case that, that to understand what's going on in these relations, it's very often, even at the local level, we have to look. So as in all historical projects, then, my goal is to complicate simplistic understandings of the problems before us, to challenge notions of inevitability, to force us to question how and why the past took the shape that it did, and to push against monocausal explanations, that is, to posit a direct and inevitable link between struggle in the Middle East and ethno-religious conflict in France. So to make this point that this is a French story, I'm going to focus on three turning points in French life that I'm going to argue shaped the course of Muslim-Jewish relations. And we're going to sort of speed through all of them, but I have found when I talk about this book, it's better to give the broad overview of the whole argument rather than a little piece of it, which leaves people not fully understanding the big picture. So the three things we're going to talk about is first, the decolonization of North Africa, then the student uprisings in France in 1968, and lastly, the 1980s experiments in multiculturalism under Mitterrand. And in doing this, I'm going to trace for you a process through which interethnic boundaries hardened over time, as I will be arguing, erasing the evidence of the more variegated landscape of Muslim-Jewish relations that existed throughout this period and to today. So, chapter one, we're going to talk about first decolonization. So my story begins there, and this starting point may already surprise, since you might anticipate that a story on Muslim-Jewish relations in France and elsewhere in the 20th century would begin either with the founding of the State of Israel in 1948 or even with controversies surrounding its emergence in the period after the British took over mandatory control of Palestine. And to be sure, there were some conflicts in France between Muslims and Jews over these issues, particularly in the southern port city of Marseille, because a lot of Moroccan and Tunisian Jews on their way to fight in Palestine passed through Marseille, and this annoyed Muslim dock workers who were working there. But generally speaking, the majority of Muslims and Jews paid really little attention to each other in 1948. And just to quickly explain this, by the mid-40s, France's Jewish population was about 200,000. It was made up mostly of Eastern European Jewish migrants and French-born Jewish citizens. The Muslim population, which had been growing significantly since World War I, hitting a peak of about 140,000 people in 1937, was comprised of largely seasonal workers from Algeria. So these folks were living in different sections of the cities in which they lived, their language, their place of origin, their status in the polity. All of these meant that they had pretty little contact with one another. And the Muslims and Jews who did regularly interact had much more that united them than divided them. That is to say, Jews and Muslims from North Africa who settled in the similar neighborhoods of Paris and Marseille and other places, mostly those two, though, who shared some of the cultural heritage from the Levant that I've already, and the Maghreb that I've already mentioned. And, you know, they would go to cafes together and buy groceries at each other's stores, et cetera. So clashes between these groups, given what I've described, was relatively rare, and I'll just add to that, both populations were relatively restrained in their public activism in the 30s and 40s for various reasons. World War II, of course, proved extremely disruptive for all French citizens and subjects, and particularly for Jews who lost their rights and property and sometimes their lives in these difficult years. And in the aftermath, that meant that most Jews and also most Muslims had more to think about than what was going on in Palestine and Israel. So North African Muslims were gearing up their energies around the independent nationalist movements that took shape in the 50s and 60s. And Jews were pretty busy rebuilding their lives and communities after the disruption of the Holocaust. Certainly among Jews, support for Zionism grew after World War II. But French Jews have been traditionally pretty reticent to voice a visible ethnic politics in France. And so even though around dinner tables and behind the scenes, support for Zionism was certainly growing in the 40s, they weren't engaged in much in the street pro-Israel demonstrations in these periods, and there were Algerians in France at the time who supported the Palestinian cause, but again, this was very, very subsumed under much larger Algerian independence movements. So 1948 saw pretty little conflict around the Palestinian issue. As French colonization, however, pushed ever larger numbers of North Africans, both Muslims and Jews, to France, these dynamics began to change in two ways that are crucial to my story. First is the way that Jewish outmigration that accompanied this process led to new conceptions of national belonging for those who left and those who watched them go. And second was the very different conditions of integration that Muslim and Jews faced upon arriving in France. So let me quickly lay both of these out in turn. So when the French pulled out of North Africa, it led to massive Jewish outmigration, among other things. In 1955 and 56 alone, 61,000 Moroccan Jews and over 15,000 Tunisian Jews left the region, followed by many more over the decades. And of course, almost the entire Algerian Jewish population in 1961 and 1962. There were lots of reasons why Jews left this region. Poverty, economic upheaval, war, fear of independence. So motivations were actually pretty diverse for the scholars who've studied this, but very often these departures came to be understood as Jewish for many people with vested interests in the region. So one key legacy of this process was the construction of what one might call a North African Jew. This was a discursive category to which no individual actually subscribed. Nobody would have defined themselves as a North African Jew in this period. But the category framed diverse Moroccan, Tunisian, and Algerian Jewish populations into a collective that was often understood to be in conflict with North Africans, Muslims, or Arabs. Now, how does this happen? How does this collective discursive category emerge? So what I argue in the book is it comes through three directions, and I'm not going to be able to lay it all out in great detail, but just quickly. So we talk about, for starters, French officials themselves, very worried about instability in North Africa, who watch very nervously what's happening in the Middle East and start to talk about problems on the ground. And sometimes when they talk about problems on the ground between Muslims and Jews, they start to make kind of categorical assessments about North African Jews as a collective. They don't do this in every document. It's not the only way they talk about Jews, but it is one way that they start to talk about Jews. Another group that starts talking about Jews this way are international Jewish aid organizations, who are very active in the Jewish world after World War II, not surprisingly, settling Jewish refugees, helping Jews who've been disrupted from World War II. These organizations have focused very little attention on the Jews of North Africa prior to the late 40s and early 50s. And in a way, they suddenly discover that there are Jews living in North Africa, as just at the moment that Israel is being founded. And they start to, driven by the best of intentions, with the goal of aiding their co-religionists throughout the region, these Jewish international agencies often interpret local Jewish life through the prism of the recent devastation in Europe and the mounting conflict between Muslims and Jews in other parts of the Middle East. So there was a lot of tension between Muslims and Jews in Iraq, for example, in Libya and other places. Not so much, actually, in North Africa. But these organizations sort of saw what was going on elsewhere and started to get really worried about what might happen in North Africa. And so local tensions, however sporadic, were often viewed as an indication of likely future violence, a problem to be solved before the fact, often by migration to Israel. So I just want to give you an example. This comes from woman who worked for the French Jewish woman who worked for the Joint Distribution Committee, who was working to help Jews in. She was talking about Algeria, actually, when she wrote this in 1950. Here's what she said. There is the certain danger, and in the source, danger is all in capitals. Okay. There is a certain danger which menaces this Jewish minority of 500,000 souls lost in a mass of about 20 million Arabs, whose scorn and hidden hostility toward the Jews has been transformed to open hate since the establishment of the State of Israel. This is not accurate, actually, of the facts on the ground. There were people who didn't like Israel very much, for sure. There was perhaps some diatribes against it in certain highly politicized circle. But this picture of 500,000 souls lost in a mass of 20 million Arabs, you can see that the language of couching the problem in those terms meant that representatives of Jewish agencies often encouraged Jews to migrate to Israel, even among Jewish populations who had not expressed any desire to do so. And when they did so, they often emphasized their co-religionists' alienation and exclusion from the entire Arab world. And then a third source for the more homogenized image of North African Jews came from indigenous national movements. Some of the leaders of the Algerian, Tunisian, and Moroccan nationalist parties. This is a complicated one because very often their official rhetoric was to downplay quarrels with local Jews because they wanted to build united national fronts. All Algerians, Muslim and Jewish, need to fight together against the colonial oppressors. All Tunisians need to. So that was certainly part of the official rhetoric. But all three movements, the main independence movements in all three countries, had spokesmen that blurred the lines between Jews and Zionists and or expressed resentment over Jewish support for the French. And in particular, when Jews did decide to go, really got annoyed that Jews were choosing to side with the French or leave and abandon the nationalist movement in that way. So here's again a quote from, this one is from the representative of the FLN in Algeria. For a long time, we have understood and even excused our Jewish friends, deceived by colonial maneuverings, for the difficulty of resolving this division, the division in Jews about where they belong, this internal tearing, this uncertainty. Today, the Algerian people must know on what side its true children will fall. And warning Jews that emigration was a sign of disloyalty to their birth nations, this kind of nationalist rhetoric throughout the region helped establish the new binaries with those which those who were monitoring Jewish life took note. So the combined voices of colonial administrators, international Jewish organizations, and national activists meant that by the end of the decolonization process, there was a North African Jewish story to tell, a story that rendered less visible the diverse ways in which Jews and Muslims interacted on the ground, or alternative political visions of Muslim-Jewish cooperation. But the impact of decolonization on Muslim-Jewish relations was more than discursive. In addition, as tens of thousands of Jews and Muslims migrated to France in the wake of decolonization, the juridical and social inequities embedded in French colonization policies were transplanted to the metropole, often causing significant resentment. And the origins of these inequities I'm not going to talk about in detail today, but they were built into the French colonial experiment from the get-go. Jews were often singled out in North Africa as more assimilable than their Muslim neighbors. In the Algerian case, this is most dramatically obvious in the granting of full equality to Algerian Jews with the Crémieux Decree, sort of ripping them out of indigenous society from a juridical perspective. The same thing doesn't happen in Morocco and Tunisia, but in both of those places, Jews are able to take better advantage for some of the same cultural reasons of assimilatory processes into the wider French colonial settler society. So although Tunisian and Moroccan Jews don't become French citizens, they had greater opportunities to acculturate to European social and cultural norms than the Muslim populations. So these inequities remained deeply salient when the French government pulled out of the region. 90% of Algerian Jews went to France with the departing French forces. And when they got there, they had faced administrative structures that distinguished them from other migrants, particularly from Muslim migrants. And even Tunisian and Moroccan Jews, who did not share the benefits of citizenship that Algerian Jews had, reported that authorities, this is a quote from one of them, bent over backwards to help them obtain French nationality while doing nothing to help incoming Muslims. That was the observation of one of these departing Tunisian Jews. So these inequities had really profound economic, cultural, and political consequences in 1960s France, among which were sharply divergent processes of Muslim-Jewish integration. Arriving Jews joined the long-rooted French-Jewish community. They spent a lot of time arguing with each other. There were plenty of divisions between the settled Jewish community and the arriving North African Jews, but nevertheless, the administrative structure that French Jews had, the social welfare structure they had in place, went a long way towards helping their incoming North African Jewish co-religionists settle into French society, whatever the divisions between them. Arriving Muslims had no such infrastructure in place. Plus, the organizations that sought to speak for them were profoundly distrusted by French authorities as sources of political instability after the violent wars of independence in North Africa. So here's one Jewish observer writing in 1962 about what it was like to arrive in France. This is an Algerian Jew arriving in the airport, and this is how he describes it. In a quarter of the airport, someone installs a small counter with stools. The seats are cramped and the signs touch each other. Catholic relief services, Jewish social services, students, Algerian gas and electric, and other with more mysterious signs. Each migrant comes to find his own. Only the Arabs have no right to any sign in particular. Having disengaged, they are part of our past, and as such, we abandon them to the good heart of the Red Cross. So this is a Jewish observer, but you get the sense of the very different processes of arrival and who's sort of being captured by someone who's helping them and who is not. So the combined impact of this asymmetrical integration and communal development process was that compared to their Muslim counterparts, French Jewish spokesmen had a far more developed apparatus with which to articulate a group politics, far greater access to national and local officials for promoting the causes important to them, and greater access to a wide range of resources. And these differences were noted. So one Algerian Muslim in France since the early 1940s, for example, complained to the mayor of Marseille of his many co-nationals who were waiting without adequate housing for years, while North African Jews were given preferential access to lodging. So here's what he wrote. This practice, this is a letter he writes to the mayor, this practice is not only revolting for its injustice, but particularly for its separatism, for all the hatreds it creates. So as his comments suggest, some Muslims viewed the relative ease of Jewish settlement as a stinging reminder of their own second-class status and of ongoing French willingness to favor some citizens over others. Let's not forget that Algerian Muslims were citizens until the Evian Accords, briefly, to be sure. They had a very brief period of citizenship, but they had been citizens and they lost it. His letter continues, I believe that it is the obligation of a politician doubling as an administrator to ensure equality between all citizens, so the public services are really used by all and do not favor one fraction of the privileged. So decolonization then meant both that new discourses of political binaries, Muslim, Jewish, hardened, while at the same time Jewish North Africans were incorporated as Europeans into the French state. While there was no immediate conflict between Muslims and Jews in France in these years, in fact, numerous indications of convivial neighborly relations suggest that in the areas where Muslims and Jews settled together, they got on just fine. It's also clear that these two indigenous North African populations were on very different trajectories that can help us understand later conflicts when they did emerge. And I will just stress here that some of the, for example, there are some camps in Marseille where there's a real housing crisis in post-war France. And so when some of these migrants arrive, whether Muslim or Jewish, there's no place for them to live, and they often end up in sort of former barracks or shanty towns living next to each other. And there's no indication for the most part that there were any problems in those places. Quite the opposite, actually. We have spotty evidence, but the evidence that we have coming out of these places, remember I told you nobody takes note when everybody's getting along, but the evidence we have suggests that if there were conflicts in these places, they didn't play themselves on religious or ethnic terms. Okay, so chapter 2. I'm going to turn to the second turning point in my story, and that is the May-June of 1968, when anarchists, Trotskyists, and Maoist students group initiated uprisings that led to the largest general strike in French history. Now here too, you might be surprised I'm not focusing on 1967 and the Arab-Israeli War as my second significant turning point in Muslim-Jewish relations in France. But in fact, that conflict, which ended with Israel's occupation of significant Arab lands, including the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, actually had very little immediate impact on daily interactions between Muslims and Jews in France. Rather, it was shifts in French political culture the following year, combined with ongoing problems caused by the tremendous disabilities facing Muslim immigrants that I just highlighted, that explains why the Israeli-Palestinian struggle began to matter to Muslim-Jewish relations in France. Now, of course, as in many Jewish communities, including here in 1967, this war was a very significant turning point for Jews. And in France, traditionally reticent Jewish political spokesmen and individuals took to the streets in very large and vocal pro-Israel demonstration. They raised a lot of money. They marched in the streets. They became politically assertive in surprising ways. Some got on planes to go to Israel to fight in the war, only to discover it was over when they got there. And there was plenty of actually anti-Arab rhetoric coming out of the community, but the rhetoric was focused very much on Arabs in the Middle East. It was focused on Nasser, it was focused on Egypt. In fact, the Jewish community seems largely unaware of the growing Muslim population around them in this, if by what one means by unaware is they're not talking about it publicly in any sense whatsoever in their press, in their minutes of their meetings, et cetera. So from a presentist perspective, this silence may seem a bit odd because the Muslim population had grown rather substantially since the last Middle Eastern war, and there was some pro-Palestinian rhetoric in that population. But in truth, North African Muslim immigrants were not nearly as taken with the Palestinian issue as French Jews were with Israel, despite the efforts of some Algerian Muslim organizations to promote the cause. So I'll just read you, this is a quote from one police report French police take a great interest in their minorities, and this is wonderful for historians because they leave reams of documents in which they've largely spied on their immigrant communities by informants from within. So anyway, this one says, such efforts, that is Algerian Muslim organizations' effort to promote the Palestinian cause in these communities, such efforts have failed to mobilize the Algerian masses in France to aid and support the Palestinian resistance. The Algerians, for the most part, are not concerned with the Palestinian matter. Now, such assessments may overlook the degree to which the Palestinian issues surfaced around cafe tables or markets in Muslim neighborhoods where French police didn't have access, but they certainly reflect the differing levels of political mobilization of French Muslim and Jewish populations during the '67 war, meaning that interethnic relations on the ground remain largely untouched. I suspect if Algerian Muslims had been marching in the streets like French Jews had been, there might have been more conflict, but that didn't happen. There was only one place where Muslim-Jewish discord did begin to grow, which helps us understand 1968, and that was on university campuses. So campus conflict was still pretty rare in '67, but the next year, after student radicalism upended the French political establishment, giving a new platform to student activists, the Palestinian issue gained significant exposure. And these developments brought visibility to highly politicized, and here I really stress a very small minority, but a very highly politicized Muslim and Jewish youth activists, solidifying a sense that Muslims and Jews more generally were on some kind of collision course. So why, may you ask, did 1968 student radicals start talking about Palestinians? And why were North African Muslims more interested in this issue, seemingly in '67, than they were in in '68 than they were in '67? The answer lies in a political alliance that was forged in '68 between French radicals and politically mobilized North African students in that May and June. Now, as you may know, the protests and strikes that spring brought to mainstream attention issues previously on the social margins of French society: feminism, sexual freedom, gay rights, anti-racism, etc. Anti-imperialism and third worldism, both ideologically central to the New Left in France and elsewhere, also won wider public hearing as campus radicals gained national attention. In particular, various groups such as the Maoists, the anarchists, the Trotskyists, while differing from strategy and ideological aims with one another, expressed broad sympathy for a wide range of anti-imperial struggles, including for the Palestinians. But the centrality of the Palestinian issue to their agenda was not merely ideological. It also came, I would argue, from more pragmatic hopes that they could win over France's large immigrant labor force, made up of, as we know, North African Muslims, to their political agendas. And the 1968 uprising broke out at the University of Nanterre, which was adjacent to France's largest immigrant slum. And this is kind of the moment when the French press and the French far left discovers the squalor in which so many tens of thousands of Muslim laborers are living. So these groups, the Maoists, the anarchists, the Trotskyists, of my little triad, they're really different from each other, but forgive me for lumping them together, hoping to distinguish themselves from the large leftist political parties, the communists, for example, who said very little on immigrant rights for all kinds of reasons, began to promote proletarian solidarity and internationalism in immigrant neighborhoods. And to win support in the relatively closed world of Muslim laborers in that workforce, they needed new tactics. So a wide range of leftist groups actually physically move in to the immigrant slums, signing up for Arabic classes, offering French literacy courses, encouraging strikes, and distributing tracts. And one of the things they do is promote Palestinian nationalism as part of these efforts, because some of these groups, particularly the Maoists, as we'll see, link the struggle for immigrant rights to their wider anti-imperial and anti-capitalist campaigns through the Palestinian issue. So the organization most known for this was called La Gauche Prolétarienne. It's a Maoist group, which in 1970 cooperated with Algerian, Tunisian, and Moroccan Muslim, Syrian, and Lebanese Muslim students to form an organization called the Comité Palestine, the Palestine Committee, Ouvrier Nanterre, so in the Workers' Palestine Committee in Nanterre. Why are these Muslim, Algerian, and Tunisian students participating in this? I told you nobody cared much about Palestinians right so far among Algerian Muslims or other Muslims in France. Well, the small group that is drawn to Maoist circles are largely drawn because of their wider commitment to social justice. Very often these are individuals who are critical of their own home governments, and they latch onto a broad range of pro-Arab causes, including the Comité Palestine, as a way to, again, try to attract immigrant laborers to a wider agenda. So the Palestinian issue comes to play a determinative role in the political evolution of a generation of North African student activists in France. Small group, but very central to this group. So linking the Palestinian revolution to the struggle of, quote, this is from one of their, sorry, let me set this up. I'm going to read you a quote from one of the pamphlets that this Maoist group circulates in some of the Muslim worker communities of Paris and Marseille. Actually, this one's in Paris. So linking the Palestinian revolution to the struggle, quote, of all Arab peoples to liberate themselves from all forms of exploitation and imperial oppression, the committee then sought to connect Algerian nationalists and Palestinians fighting Israel to immigrants in France. So listen to this. This is a quote from the pamphlet. In the working districts of France, we have organized meetings where for the first time since Algerian independence, 800 immigrant and French workers have come together to support the Palestinian revolution. And the track's authors go on to say that Algerian Muslims should care about the Palestinian plight, both because it mirrored their own struggle in France, it was similar to their own struggle, and because it was part of Arab efforts to free themselves from Western domination. So in this way, the Palestinian cause, through the efforts of these individuals, the Palestinian cause was linked to the anti-racist campaign in France and to efforts to better working conditions. They all come together. So here's the police again, weighing in, the police spying and weighing in. Here's what they have to say about this. As the committee mixes the very real complaints of the people in the neighborhood with those concerning the Palestinian issue, they make it necessary to accept or reject both issues in one block. So the issues become fused. Now, all evidence suggests that despite these efforts, most North African Muslim laborers in France had very little interest in the Palestinian issue in '68. According to one North African Muslim militant, for example, so one of the people working in these committees, the Muslim laboring population often criticized the Palestinian focus of these groups. And He's quoting what was said to him. "You speak to us only of Palestine, us who live in shit. Who is going to defend us?" And several reports similarly document the lack of interest in the 60s and early 70s. Nevertheless, the alliance between French radicals and North African Muslim students brought the Palestinian issue to French public attention and brought politically active Muslim and Jewish radicals into conflict in visible ways. Indeed, the Muslim student politicization around the Arab-Israeli issue found its mirror reflection in France's Jewish student population. So there were about 170,000 Jewish students in 1970 in France. Something like 5,000 to 6,000 of them were enrolled in universities, and of them, maybe 10% were affiliated with Jewish organizations. So again, we're talking about a very small number of people. But those people were very active and often very pro-Zionist in their sensibilities. And particularly in 68, when there's a lot of other radicalism, the Jewish students in these universities become radicalized as well. Often, in fact, this is a moment where some of them break away from the far left because they're upset about the pro-Palestinian sensibilities they see there. So many of those who took to the streets had families who'd suffered during the Holocaust, and their engagement with the student movement politicized these memories. Some moved towards radical leftist ideologies, but for others, militancy around Israel became a key issue. So now what do you have? You have campuses with radicalized leftist groups, some very militant activist Muslim students, and some heavily politicized Jews. And what do? They start to fight publicly. Big ways, not big fights, but very visible ones. And I'm not going to give you too many examples, but they beat each other up with sticks, they scrawl graffiti at each other at events, they pass out flyers, they say really, really, really nasty things about each other. And most of this makes its way into one form or another into the French fight. Fist fights, Palestine will overcome, death to the Jews, you name it. And this rhetoric really has repercussions. So in June 1970, for example, vandals ransacked the headquarters of two North African Muslim student groups, scrawling "Israel will overcome" on the walls. Just one of many examples I could give you. Nobody was ever caught. I can't prove to you that a Jewish student radical wrote that, but chances are good given what was going on. So as such examples suggest, the publicly visible and at times violent confrontations between Muslim and Jewish youth in 68 resulted in increasing polarization around Middle Eastern politics, as the Jewish community, already galvanized by 67, took notice, and as large numbers of Muslim immigrants came to see themselves as having a stake in France's domestic and international affairs. But, and here's the interesting thing, the tumultuous environment also created rather unexpected alliances. In fact, the very radicals who promoted Palestinian interests and who worked with Muslim activists to fight racism were often Jewish. And if you remember, the Maoist group, La Gauche Prolétarienne, that I mentioned, is run by a survivor, a child of Holocaust survivors in France himself, lived through Vichy. Later, he rejects his leftist politics and moves to Israel. But in this period, he's probably the single most responsible for promoting the Palestinian cause in France, and he, of course, was Jewish. So this and he's not alone, he's just one example. So this cooperation reminds us that Jewish-Muslim polarization around the Middle East was not a predetermined outcome of ethnic transnational allegiances. Rather, when polarization did emerge, it did so as a product of the political space created by late 1960s French radical culture, which both made room for a new generation of Muslim activists who infused their pro-immigrant politics with the Palestinian issue and pushed France's Jewish population, and particularly its high school and university students, away from traditional affiliations on the left and towards a more combative politics. The result was a growing number of highly visible Muslim-Jewish conflicts that linked Jews with Israel and North African Muslims with Palestinians in increasingly rigid ways. And the results of these developments were threefold. First, the radicalization brought the discussion of Muslim-Jewish conflict into France's national conversation. This now became mainstream. If you read the press, people worried about it, that the Middle East was coming to France. Secondly, the fusion between leftism, between gauchism, immigrant politicization, and Jewish radicalism, although touched a very small number in each population, meant that people presumed that ethnic tensions were a much wider phenomenon. And lastly, by the mid-70s, Muslims and Jews began to see each other as competitors in the French public square. This is really a new development. So here's the words of one Jewish commentator writing roughly in this sort of the early 1970s. Our, meaning Jews, our only weapon is public opinion in this country, where we number hardly 1%. Less numerous than the Arabs, who do not have the right to vote, but ballots, alas, count for little, and they can strike, which we cannot. Now, you can see this quote actually underscored Jews' insider position as citizens against Arab foreignness, but it portrayed them both as pitted against each other in the court of public opinion. And this is really a shift. I told you up until this point, Jews had barely noticed that there were Muslims living around them. So now we have the beginning here of a sort of noticing and saying, you know, we have to fight for our place somehow against them. And as a new generation of Muslim activists began to strive for their place in the polity, equal access to all of the benefits of French citizenship became a new domain of Muslim-Jewish contestation. And that brings me to the last chapter, which I'll cover more briefly. And that is 1980s France. So 1980s France is a moment that seems to dispel completely any straight line of inevitability, intensification of Muslim-Jewish conflict. In fact, the first half of the decade was characterized by very visible and remarkable interethnic cooperation due to a very notable change in French political life. But a subsequent shift, as we'll see, brought this nascent cooperation to a sudden end, solidifying the sense that more divided than united Muslim and Jewish French citizens. Okay, so the first of these developments was the coming of age of a new generation of French-born Muslim activists who began to articulate a politics of resistance to their political and social exclusion. This was the Burr movement. You may have read about it. We're getting into more recent history now. This creates a new momentum around identity politics in France among Muslim-born French citizens. The second development evolved from experiments in multiculturalism that followed President Mitterrand's victory in the 1981 presidential elections on a platform that included calls for greater immigrant rights and decentralization. So this is the first time, it's a very brief moment, but it is the first time in the history of the 20th century that I know of that the French political establishment, which was known for its commitment to state-centered assimilationist policies, recognized in law the nation's cultural and linguistic diversity. And the campaign Mitterrand ran on was the right to be different, the droit à la différence. So for young Muslim and Jewish activists who took advantage of this legal recognition of difference, the public square was now open to unprecedented expressions of communal politics. And this leads to two overlapping but kind of competing forms of politicization. On the one hand, particularistic struggles, people saying, you know, we as Muslims, we as Jews need certain rights because of who we are. Very uncommon in France, atypical in France, but that starts to happen in the early 80s. And it's most evident in the Burr movement's anti-racist demonstrations, which take over the media in the early 80s. But if particularisms create a kind of ethnic polarization, there was a second response to the legitimization of the diverse landscapes, which people called pluriculturalism. Now, pluriculturalism, as opposed to the more commonly deployed multiculturalism, refers to bridging differences in order to create a democratic and just public sphere. And this was most evident in a new anti-racist organization that was founded in the early 1980s, that argued that whatever differences marked French citizens, they could work together to create a tolerant and just society. And the name of this organization was SOS Racism. It still exists now. It's not quite as famous as it was in the early 80s. SOS Racism was founded out of the Socialist Party, largely. And that's what most people remember about it. But actually, it very famous and visibly was a product of Muslim and Jewish cooperation. So the organization that was behind it, the organization besides the Socialist Party, was the French Student Union. And they were working very closely with some very well-known representatives of the Burr generation. And together, they made the case that anti-racist organizations in the past have been too particularistic, and what we need to do now is join together to defend interethnic France. And so second-generation youth politics sort of energized. They put huge demonstrations, concerts. They sold badges. The famous phrase for the badge was "touche pas à mon pote," hands off my friend. And so this was a media sensation. They sold 1.5 million badges in 1985 alone. And the term pote, that friend, symbolized a new figure that was neither entirely French nor foreign. So key to SOS Racism's struggle was the assertion that a truly multicultural France could transcend ethno-religious divisions to constitute a united civil society. And Jews and Muslims worked together very actively in this organization. And yet, after about 3 or 4 years, this period of cooperation falls apart as French political culture turned to the right. So the 1986 parliamentary elections proved a repudiation of Mitterrand's socialist hold over French politics, ushering in a period with a president from one party, Mitterrand, and a prime minister from another, Jacques Chirac. And while Mitterrand won re-election in 88, bringing back a leftist majority, from 86 to 88, the balance of power had shifted. Probably more importantly, the Front National, who's back in the news again, won a stunning electoral victory, including earning 14% or nearly 4.5 million votes cast in the first round of the May 88 presidential elections. And in response, Chirac's government ushered in a period of really strict immigration controls. And both politics on the left and right, both socialists and sort of center-right and center-left, start backing away from the right to be different, making the case, and this is when the first headscarf controversy breaks out. It's right in this moment when suddenly being different in the public sphere maybe wasn't such a good idea after all. Let's quash difference. And really, although the politics on the left and right differ in their specific political claims about how to solve the problem of immigration and difference, both kind of backpedal seriously and integration, once again, rather than the right to be different, becomes the watchword of the day. So media outlets start to focus again on Boer criminality, the threat of Islam, Arab fanaticism, etc. So this mounting conservatism was mostly directed at France's Muslim population, but it affected all religious minorities, particularly in 89 when 3 girls were expelled from school wearing the Islamic headscarf. And while some Jews defended particularism in the schools, others at this moment start to back away from a public connection to Muslims, asserting the fusion of Jewishness and Frenchness in contradistinction to Muslim foreignness. Meanwhile, Muslim activists who had seen value in underscoring a common anti-racist agenda with Jews began reasserting the particularist nature of their own struggles. And this even some of the leaders of SOS Racism start to do. So by the decade's end, the much celebrated efforts at cross-ethnic cooperation had given way to distrust and bitterness, and fears of Muslim-Jewish conflict began to take center stage. During the 1991 Gulf War, for example, journalists, government officials, and religious leaders predicted widespread Muslim-Jewish conflict in response to unfolding events in the Middle East. The fact that such fears never materialized is one of the paradoxes I hope I've begun to explain. Indeed, whatever their links to the Middle East, and such ties were never homogeneous or frozen in time, Muslims and Jews related to each other also as former residents of French North Africa, immigrants competing for limited resources, employers and employees, victims of racist aggression, religious minorities in a secularizing state, and citizens. These multiple and complex interactions were often lost as a narrative of polarization took root. In tracing the way Muslim-Jewish has become shorthand for a rigid opposition politics that has obscured a more complex interethnic landscape, I've sought tonight to trace both the multifaceted origins of the charged political landscape and to underscore its powerful impact. While language of conflict may not accurately describe the daily interactions of most Muslims and Jews throughout the period under study, the emergence of this political landscape shaped the parameters of public discourse and narrowed the range of choices available to those representing communal life. The marked rise in anti-Jewish violence in 2000 emerged from this history of narrowing political categories and also helped solidify them, meaning that whatever the diversity of social life on the ground, Muslim-Jewish conflict is likely to remain a salient feature of French political life for the foreseeable future. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a wonderful lecture.
Sorry, it was a little long.
No, I
It's
don't.
really a complex story.
You said 50 minutes?
Yeah,
It was 50 minutes.
Okay.
And you're not being paid by the minute. Maud has kindly agreed to take questions or respond to comments. So if you have a question or have a comment that you'd like to offer, please throw your hand in the air and Maud will call on you.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much indeed. It was excellent.
Thank you so much.
You have to speak up, I think.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed your paper. I was just wondering whether discourses of racialization were in any way present either in the rhetoric of the Jewish or the Muslim communities at this time. Okay. They're trying to construct each other as people who are
in some racialized sense. Okay, I'll just repeat the question because I don't know if everybody could hear it. The question was whether the populations that I was studying talked in racialized terms about each other in the period under study. And the truth is not so, so for the first half of the story, they're not even talking about each other very much, right? So, and when they do, the conversations are much more complex than racialized, I would say. That is to say, so if you just take, for example, the Muslim nationalist movements in North Africa, they have lots of things to say about Jews. Most of them are, some people choose not to believe their rhetoric, but the rhetoric is an inclusive one, that we're all Algerian, we're all Moroccan, we're all Tunisian. That's one kind of rhetoric. Another rhetoric is Zionists are, and our enemy. So Zionists become very essentialized, but there's actually an attempt to sort of withdraw Jews in that context. Having said that, the more what I would call binaries start to hide, these hard binaries start to harden, there is more of that. But it is not the major discourse that I found, at least in the kind of social historical realm that I looked. Thank you. Yes, please.
Yes, again, thank you very much for an excellent lecture. I want to bring up the question of Arab versus Muslim.
Yes, please.
You've covered 20th century and into the 21st. But there was a shift, I think, that in fact in the 1960s, 67, 68, and into the 1980s, didn't speak very much about Muslims, spoke about Arabs. And I think that has a significance, the kind of constructed discursive category of Arab and that of Muslim also has important political implications. That in fact, whereas as Arabs, they could be part of this anti-imperialist, leftist, liberationist ideology. And indeed, many French and other Europeans saw Algeria in the early days of independence as a potential socialist entity in their construction. The becoming Muslim, for a variety of reasons, in the late 1980s and into the present time, associates that category politically not with the left and the liberationists, but with much more with the Salafis and the jihadis and the it becomes a different kind of racialization, a different kind of identity definition.
Yes.
To me, that's a very significant shift.
Yeah.
Not just in France,
I completely
but
agree.
elsewhere.
Yeah. Do you want to say something else?
That's fine.
No, I completely agree. I will tell you, I struggled enormously with the word in this instance. Actually, in both cases, it's less charged in the Jewish cases because there's a sort of a consensus understanding that we call Jews Jews now. But the truth is, French Jews in the 19th century weren't called Jews. They were called Israelites, and the move to Jews was actually a racialized move that then Jews adopt on their own eventually. So now it's acceptable to call them Jews because they call themselves Jews. But it's actually not much less historically complicated. The move you're talking about was even harder for me because my own sources changed. So when I was writing about the 60s, the 50s and the 60s and early 70s, the French talk about the population I'm writing about as Arabs, North Africans, sometimes indigenous, sometimes North African, Maghrebi. They never say, well, I shouldn't say they never say Muslim. They sometimes say Muslim, but it's one of many things, and it's not the most common. And it's only with the Iranian Revolution at the end of the 70s and fears about radical Islam that French media and officials start talking about Muslims. And the Rushdie affair, you're quite right. And I agree, but I have a long sort of several paragraphs in the introduction defending the choice of the term, but it was very difficult. And actually one of my reviewers who read the manuscript suggested I switch halfway through the book, but I thought that was confusing in its own right. And I personally wanted to steer away from the word Arab because I thought it overemphasized the connection to the Middle East, which I was really trying to write against. So that's my sort of intellectual justification. But from a historical point, you're quite right. And it's actually a bit of a problem in the study. There's a question way in the back, yes.
Do you think the official policy of memory in France has an impact on Jewish-Muslim relationship? I mean, now with this affair Dieudonné, it has been brought to the fore again, but I mean, France really, as every country, which is completely normal, sort of commemorates the Holocaust a lot and doesn't think about its past as much in the colonies, I would say.
Yeah, I think it's had an impact in two somewhat maybe contradictory ways. On the one hand, so for a long time after World War II, nobody really talked about the Holocaust in France. And after 1967, there's some debate about when it starts, but let's say starting in 1967, there's a real shift. And a lot of attention starts to be paid to the Holocaust by French Jews and increasingly by the state. So on the one hand, I think that move actually has a kind of bounce back effect on other silences. So that is to say, I think even, another group I study is Armenians. They start talking about the genocide of World War I after Jews start talking about the Holocaust. And I think also the focus on decolonization as a kind of genocidal racist attack is in some ways an effect of people having started to talk about the Holocaust. Having said that, what you're implying is also true, which is that in French society, particularly since the time I covered in this lecture, since 2000, the fact that French society has not come to terms with its North African past in the way it's come to terms with its Holocaust past, if one can say that it has, disagreement about that, but more, let's say, has caused real anger in some of the neighborhoods where Muslims and Jews sometimes cohabit and sometimes don't, but particularly in school systems where the Holocaust is taught systematically and decolonization isn't taught quite in the way that makes local populations as happy. And so that has caused, yes, I would say it has caused it has been another source of conflict since the period I was writing about. Yeah, yes, please.
I just wondered if I could raise two other points, which you may, I haven't read the book yet, so you may well relate to them in the book.
Yes.
One of them is the fact that the French were not just fighting Arabs and Muslims in North Africa, but of course they were assisting Zionism, including against Britain in the 40s.
Yes.
So, in a sense, the political map was drawn in kind of black and white. The other thing, of course, is the partaking of Israel, France, and Britain in the tripartite attack on Egypt.
Yeah.
And I just wondered if those have fed into the complex picture that you are painting.
Actually, right, I can't talk about everything here. The first chapter of the book talks about, I said here today quickly that there wasn't much conflict in 1948 in France, but actually the little conflict that did break out, which, as I mentioned, happened in Marseille, the argument I make there is sort of draws from something you just said, which is that insofar as there was antagonism, and there was in small circles in Marseille in 1948, a lot of it very clearly was frustration at France's role. So in 1948, we're not yet at decolonization. The North African dock workers, mostly Algerian in Marseille, are actually becoming French citizens, right? French policy is changing. They're, in theory, becoming citizens. And what, at this moment, when they're, at least in theory, being incorporated into the French state, they find the French state, what they say, these are direct quotes, favoring Jewish refugees. So they're the citizens of France, and the French state is supporting Jewish refugees to go to Israel to fight the Palestinians and the Arabs. It's not really, they don't use the word Palestinian, but to fight, over the Holy Land and to fight the Arabs. And so, in fact, the struggle over Israel becomes, when it plays itself out between Muslims and Jews in France, and that's just one example, but it often becomes over sort of who is the French state siding with, and what does that mean, and what does it say about their the way they've been claimed by the state. And so Suez is similar, and in some ways even more so, because in 1948, while it's true that France is allowing Jewish refugees to go to Israel, they don't recognize Israel publicly, precisely because if you read the document, the French foreign officials in North Africa are saying, the colonial administrators are saying, we can't support Israel because we don't. This is a direct quote. I can tell you this one by heart from the book because it was so striking to me. This is the late 1940s. A colonial administrator says, "We don't have a Jewish problem. We have an Arab problem." And the reason that sticks in my mind, this is 1948. They had a Jewish problem, right? 3 years before, they had a really big Jewish problem, but it's gone. There's no Jewish problem anymore in post-World War II France, and now they have an Arab problem. So they say, right, we can't let our North African Muslim populations see that we support Israel, so we're not going to publicly. By the 50s, they are, shipping arms to Israel. They're very supportive of Israel. That changes again in the 60s, but in the 50s, they're very supportive. And that is, insofar as anybody's talking about it on the Muslim side, it's a bone of contention, but there aren't that many people talking about it. And I think that, again, we don't know what people were talking about around their dinner tables and in the privacy of their own homes. So I can only speak to public outcry, and there's very little. And in part, of course, that they have a lot of other things on their mind. These are laborers. They're largely illiterate. This is not a group of people that is going to create if they engage in politics, they'll probably be deported, right? So this is not a group that's going to be highly politicized around some event in the Middle East. Yes.
Yes, I have a question about, it's almost a methodological question.
Yes.
You look at the Muslims and Arabs in France, the Jews in France, and France itself,
Yeah.
French society. And I imagine that it's very, very complicated, very complex to describe this
Yes.
triple bind, which is, reinforcing itself over time. How do you project from these periods which you have looked at in more detail and which you presented? How do you project this to the present time and the future? Because obviously what we have is a very strong reassertion of Muslim identity. I mean, people speak of ethnicization of Islam, especially in France. We have Diana Pinto speaking about the fact that Israel has moved, which has a lot to do with, which impacts on French Jewry a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So French Jewry is much more interested in Israel right now than it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. So the relationship of Jews to the transnational Jewish community changes, and this diminishes the place of France. And so this is the third player. What do you do? How do you conceptualize the place of the French project in all this, the Universalist project, which seems to be going to be underwhelmed. I mean, to be pushed to the side as one of the options of defining a shared ground or a common future or whatever, shared project.
Yeah. It's partly why my conclusion was rather bleak, actually, because my own view, so I'm a historian, and I actually stayed away from writing about after 2000 for methodological reasons. Historians like beginning, middles, and ends, and I was a little unclear what end I was going to come to if I started writing about after 2000. But I really do think after, and why I end with the first Gulf War, is that with the breakdown of that Mitterrand experiment, that the space for the French Republican project in these communities started to really shrink dramatically. And this isn't so much my research, but there's a very interesting book out by a young American anthropologist who's written on French Jews. And she's really focused on a very specific subset of the Jewish community, but she shows how that turn inward is happening in that community and how it's racializing, to get back to your question now, racializing itself, sort of proudly declaring itself racist and sort of turning in. And one could make the same argument. I want to be a little cautious. We have millions of Muslims in France. And so I sometimes think the arguments about, and even Jews, while this scholar I'm talking about does point to a real phenomenon, I think she's talking about a very specific subset of the population. There are all kinds of people who are integrating into the French Republican project. But to the extent that what my book is interested in is that we as a society, a world, become interested not in those people. We are interested in the ones who catch the media attention, and then that defines our reality. So the Jews moving to Israel, even though actually statistically it's not nearly as striking as the media has made it out, but that captures our attention. The Muslims who do some very violent thing in light of radical Islam, not very common response among the Muslim population, but that captures our attention, and then that creates reality. And so my own sense is that unless the French state does something radical to change its political orientation and its socioeconomic structure, I see a lot of this rooted in equity, as I hope I made clear. I see this sticking with us for a while. I do think it's in danger, that project. Yes?
I find quite strange the preference you describe that the Jewish state has for the Jewish population, given its long history of anti-Semitism, which still continues, and also, specifically during the Second World War with what happened in northern France and in Vichy, and whether there's any element of trying to assuage guilt of some sort, or because it seems like a sort of turnaround of things like the better of two evils, or
right. I think, look, my own view as a scholar studying this from the distance of the United States and from the distance of time, which historians have, is that there's been a pretty dramatic shift in the way French society deals with Jews since World War II. And to me, it looks like a diminishment of what one might call traditional anti-Semitism, which is not to say it doesn't still exist. It always exists. Anti-Semitism always exists. Racism always exists. So the question you have to ask is, what's the nature of the threat? Is it preventing people from living where they want to live, marrying who they want to marry, doing the jobs that they want to do? And that can shift over time. It can get worse and it can get better, right? So I think there actually has been a change. Your question is whether it has to do with guilt. I don't think so, actually. My own view is that, I'm following here another scholar, but I think it's right, that when France pulled out of Algeria and brought the Algerian Jews to France as Europeans, sort of claimed them as Europeans, that the division was shifted. And then Jews came to be seen much more as European than the arriving Muslims, who looked very foreign, and French Islam, or I don't really want to say Christian Islam, divide becomes the more salient division in French society after that time. Does that mean if we polled French people today, we wouldn't find out there was anti-Semitism? Of course we would. I just saw there was some poll in the United States that says did you see this? 25% of all adults in the world have never heard of the Holocaust. Of course there's still anti-Semitism in the world, but thinking about it historically, about what's changed and how and why, I think there's been a shift myself. I've been accused of being overly optimistic, though. So, are there any other questions? Julie.
You got to yell. Okay. Is there any interplay between the internal dynamic within the French Jewish community and then the way it interacts with Muslims, in the sense of North African Sephardic Jews coming to these very well entrenched Ashkenazi Jews who really don't want to identify with this new population and the efforts of the new populations to be recognised as French Jews?
Yeah, so that's some of what I had to skip. But actually what's really interesting in the first few years, and by that I mean at least a decade after North African Jews come to France, while the settled French Jewish population welcomes them, there's also plenty of division and discord, as you're suggesting. And some of that discord plays itself out in ways that position the arriving North African Jews as Muslims. So, for example, I have one source where there's a fight in Marseille between the settled Jewish community and the arriving Jews, and the settled Jewish community says, you're like Arabs, right? I mean, it's like it's a slur, and it's used that way, back to kind of racialize. You're like them, you're not like us, right? So it's used in that way. Likewise, and this is one of my favorite anecdotes that ends the book. In 1991, it was in the late 80s, in Marseille, the settled, established consistorial synagogue had a schism, and some Tunisian Jews pulled out, and they couldn't get access because of that to, there was a struggle over kosher butchers, over who would be allowed to slaughter meat, and over, because the consistoire, the French consistorial system has a monopoly on that. And so these Tunisian Jews forged an alliance with a Muslim butcher in Marseille and started using his license as a way to produce the kosher meat that they needed to do. Right. So there are plenty of times, and that's why the evidence is all over the place in the book, but it's kind of anecdotal in the sense of look at all these ways in which relations are much more complex and convivial and interesting on the ground, and the way in which we have been left with just this story of polarization. So, right, here we, yeah. Is this,
just one last
oh,
question.
I didn't see. Yes.
Yeah.
Sure.
There's reference to a rise in anti-Semitism.
Yes.
I'd be interested to know, how possible is it to look at this quantitatively? Obviously, there are a lot of classification problems, but are there any numbers over time?
Yes. Actually, all kinds of Jewish organizations in France study anti-Semitism right now and count incidents, and that suggests a rise. What we don't know is if that's because there's literally a rise, or if it's because people are now reporting things, right? So that's just something we have to study over time and sort of use as our benchmark the beginning of when we started to. But there's no question that there's been a lot of things that have happened since 2000 that have made French Jews very unhappy about the state of affairs, and that is what people point to when they say there's been a rise. But usually what they're pointing to is not, there is a French far right that does still engage in anti-Semitic acts, but usually what they're pointing to are these disenfranchised youth in the French urban working class neighborhoods who lash out sometimes, graffiti and acts of violence at their neighbors. But this hasn't been a straight line. It's been like this, right? And it's often now, unlike when I was studying, correlated to things that happen in the Middle East. So, thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Maud. Maud, as you will have gathered, studied in the United States, and I studied in this country, but we do have one teacher in common. And that teacher in common wrote a book which had nothing to do with Muslims and Jews or France, but it was called A Crooked Line. And I think that not least what has been wonderful and illuminating about Maud's talk this evening is that it has laid out the crooked line that goes from 1945 to the present when we look at the interaction and the relationship between Muslims and Jews in France. In a moment, I will ask you to thank Maud for her lecture in a conventional way, but another way in which you can thank Maud for her wonderful lecture is to pick up a flyer at the back of the room and to purchase Muslims and Jews in France, History of a Conflict from Princeton University Press. But in the meantime, as a sort of a down payment on that, I would like you to join me in showing your appreciation for a wonderful lecture. Thank you very much.